All right, so our next speaker is Asmae Toumi. Okay, that's how you correctly pronounce her name. There are a lot of other variations out there, but I confirm that that is the correct pronunciation of her name. So it's Asmae. And she's editor-in-chief at Hockey Graphs. She manages the day-to-day operations and oversees the editorial and creative process. In her role, she spearheaded a mentorship program pairing NHL data scientists and executives with underrepresented persons. She has hosted multiple workshops in data viz and modeling at MIT Sloan Sports Analytics conferences. She also works for the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute of Technological Assessment as a data analyst. Asmae recently presented at the New England Symposium on Statistics in Sports and the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Conference. So, without further ado.
Thank you to Professors Shuckers and Professor Mills, who unfortunately couldn't be here without us. This has been a huge success, and I'm really honored to be here. Just to jump off a point by Ryan Stimson, it is still really hard to imagine myself being here, and it's a huge honor, so thank you for being here. Today we'll be talking about zone entry decision-making in the NHL. And before we get started, this is a disclaimer, you guys. Micah gave me a nighttime Tylenol about an hour or two ago. So if I fall asleep, please come over and give me a few slaps. So thank you, Brian, for introducing me. Again, I'm editor-in-chief of Hockey Graphs, and I'm a data analyst at the MGH in Harvard Medical School. And my collaborator on this project is Michael Lopez, a man that needs very little introduction. He's the director of data and analytics at the NFL, and he's professor of statistics at Skidmore College. So we're here for zone entries. And what are zone entries? I trust that everyone in this room probably knows what they are, but just in case, let's go over them very quickly. So a carry-in is when you carry the puck with possession across the blue line. And you have a dump-in, which, as the name suggests, just involves dumping the puck in across that blue line. And the reason why we care about zone entries is because lots of researchers, like Eric Tulsky, showed that entries with possession are more than twice as effective as dump-ins at 5-on-5. And therefore, they're a critical driver of success. So our goal today will be to estimate the potential benefit that teams can gain by carrying the puck in versus dumping it. And as we've seen, hasn't this been done before? Well, yes, but previous research did not account for certain confounders that we've had the chance to have access to. And a causal inference framework would allow you to account for a lot of confounders and would allow you to make an apples-to-apples comparison. And a confounder is something that simultaneously affects your outcome, but also one of the other variables in your model. And so when you want to estimate a causal benefit, you really do want to be accounting for all of those. So what is causal inference? We're going to try to build our intuition about this with a pretty classical example of ice cream sales that you see with the green line and shark attacks with the purple line. And you can see that these two are highly correlated. However, we know that ice cream sales do not cause shark attacks. So correlation is not causation. But what if there was a way to know under which circumstances we can establish that correlation is causation? We can, but that would necessitate that we control for all the confounders. And so is there a framework that allows us to do that? And the answer is yes, and it's very exciting, and it's causal inference, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So causal inference is a field of statistics. It is quite complex, and it comes with its own language. So I think it's worthwhile for us to go through those together, because I will keep referencing them as the presentation goes on. The first notion is the notion of causality, and it's linked to a manipulation, like a treatment, that is applied to a unit. And the manipulation can be, again, it can be a treatment, an intervention, a strategy that is applied to a unit. And what is a unit? A unit, very simply, is the thing that receives the treatment or the manipulation. It can also not receive it, and the thing could also be exposed to an alternative action altogether. But to keep it simple, we usually like to think of the unit as either receiving the manipulation or not receiving the manipulation. And the unit is linked to potential outcome. So before the treatment, there are two potential outcomes. And then we actually get to observe only one of them. So let's go through a very simple example with these new definitions that we've learned. So a person may or may not receive the drug if they're sick. One potential outcome is years survived after receiving the drug. And the other potential outcome is years survived if the person had not received the drug. And so to put some labels on this, the person would be the unit, receiving the drug would be the treatment, the years survived would be the outcome, and that last chunk there is what we call a counterfactual. And a counterfactual is an outcome that is only potential, so it's an outcome that we don't actually observe for a given unit, in this case for the given patient. So to formalize things a tiny bit, what we define as a causal effect is receiving treatment for a unit and then comparing those potential outcomes that we call Y. In our very simple example, that would be the outcome of receiving the drug minus the outcome of not receiving the drug. And this comparison of the potential outcomes is called the treatment effect. So I think so far, so good. It's pretty straightforward, but there's one thing that adds significant complexity to performing causal inference analysis, and that is what we call the fundamental problem of causal inference, which is that for a given unit, we can obviously not observe both potential outcomes, just one. And because of this, unit-level causal effects cannot be determined. However, there is a solution to this, and the solution is to perform what's called a randomized control trial. And one of the benefits of a random control trial is that randomization helps us to isolate the effect we are interested in measuring by making sure that the two comparison groups are otherwise similar on all relevant variables. So this is truly what will allow us to tease out that causal benefit. It's because we have groups that are similar on all of our covariates. But you can imagine a randomized control trial isn't always possible. They're very costly, and many times they're completely unethical. You can imagine that if you were to run an experiment and expose humans to sharks just because you want to establish causality with that graph you first saw, that wouldn't be okay at all. So how do we correct for this? Well, thankfully, there are many causal inference techniques that we can use. The first one being propensity score matching, and the second is BART. BART stands for Bayesian additive regression trees, and we'll be going over that shortly. So what do these methods help us do exactly? They help us estimate population-level causal effects. And those come in two major flavors. The first one is ATE, it's the average treatment effect. And the second one, which is slightly different and more specific, is the average treatment effect on the treated. And so just a reminder, our goal is to estimate the potential benefit that teams can gain by carrying the puck in versus dumping it. And the data we have is zone entry tracking data from Stathletes for the two most recent seasons. We have about 277,000 entries at 5-on-5, of which 158,000 are carry-ins and the rest are dump-ins. From Evolving Hockey, who are here, thank you, we've obtained goals plus minus per 60 minutes from them. That is a metric that we use to account for players' skill. And we've also obtained from them expected goals, and expected goals is the outcome that we're going to be interested in today. So before we get into propensity score matching in BART, I would like to share with you some plots that we generated when we first got the data, which might be of interest. The first one we see here is the proportion of entry type, with the y-axis being proportion as a percent and game minutes. And this graph is also faceted by period. And I think the interesting takeaway from this one is that you see the dump-ins increasing in proportion as the game is winding down. The next plot that we thought was of interest too is the distribution of remaining shift length in seconds, again by type of entry. We have the carry-ins in pink, the dump-ins in blue, and those dashed lines correspond to medians. The next analysis that we did, mostly as a sanity check, is to see the top 20 players by mean dump-ins. And no surprise here, we have a mix of players that you'd expect would be on this list, to put it mildly. Similarly, we looked at top 20 players by mean carry-in. And no surprise here again, there are lots of excellent players on this list, specifically my favorite, Brad Marchand, which brings me joy every single time I see him on a leaderboard. And I swear to God, I did not manipulate this data in any sense, but he just so happened to have an extremely nice rate of 0.69 for his mean carries. Again, no doctoring was involved. My entire code is available on GitHub if you'd like to see that for yourself. So another thing we thought was interesting was explore one of our confounders, so goals plus minus per 60 minutes on the x-axis, and see what those look like for defensemen versus forwards as a function of expected goals for 30 seconds. And so we can see here that forwards have the clear advantage there. So this graph motivates a really important process that we wanted to do, which is we really want to assess if there's a difference in benefit after adjusting for potential confounders like the one we saw in the previous graph, so goals plus minus. If we don't adjust for confounders, we have what's called treatment selection bias. So in other words, not only would we be observing the effect of a carry-in on expected goals, but we could also be observing the effect of player skill on expected goals, which is the latter being not what we are interested in and the former being exactly what we want. So let's go through the first technique that we use, which is a propensity score model. technique that estimates the effect of a treatment by accounting for the covariates that predict receiving the treatment. Again, these are the confounders. And the process, first, you run a logistic regression model, and I will explain why you do that first. Then you match, so you try to get those very similar groups so you're able to tease out that causal benefit. And the way you calculate that causal benefit is by estimating the ATT. The ATT, again, is that second flavor of population level causal effect. It stands for average treatment effect on the treated. And the reason why we picked this one versus the other flavor is because carrions are considered the gold standard in hockey. And so we specifically wanted to estimate the causal benefit of a carrion among those who carried it in. So first, you run a multiple logistic regression in order to estimate the probability of a player carrying the bug in, which is a probability of receiving treatment. And that probability is called a propensity score. And we did that by accounting for the following game characteristics. So starting with position of the entry player, the score differential, the shift length for the entry player, seconds left in the game, the X and Y coordinates of the entry, GPM per 60 for our player skill, and 2 interaction terms that we thought would be valuable for the next process, which is matching. We also threw in some spline knots, and we optimized those in order to get the best AIC. So the second step in the process is matching. I'm going to give you a very quick overview. It's a process where first you start by randomly selecting one player with a carrion. You match this player with the closest one propensity score-wise for a certain threshold, and you continue matching until all possible pairs are identified. So I've included a very simple diagram. So you could imagine the first line corresponding to those players with the probability of receiving a carrion, and the second line being those with the probability of receiving a dump-in. And those probabilities are from 0 to 1. And you can see that player A1 has been matched with B1. Similarly for A2 with B2 and A3 for B3. And the matching is done by how close they are in propensity score. And you can see on the far left side, there's 2 players that have not been matched, and it's because they haven't met our criteria for closeness. So once you do this matching, the way to assess if you have gotten good balance is with density curves. So on the left, you have before matching. There is some overlap, but not enough. Whereas after matching, you have near complete overlap, which tells us that our matching algorithm worked very well. And this is for about 153,000 matched pairs. So once we're happy with the matching, we can go ahead and estimate the ATT. So with our propensity score model, the estimated ATTs for the 3 outcomes considered are in this table. So it's about 0.02 in terms of average expected goals per 30 seconds. It's exactly 0 for expected goals against, which means that there is no detriment to carrying it in. And likewise, for shots on goal per 30 seconds, there is a clear advantage to carrying it in. And if we do the math, there's approximately 1 extra goal produced every 50 carrions, given that there are about 30 carrions per team per game. So it adds up quite rapidly. The next technique we used is BART. BART is, again, Bayesian additive regression trees, and and it's a Bayesian non-parametric modeling procedure. And it has many advantages over the first procedure that I've shown you. One of them is that it's relatively easy to implement. There is very little tuning involved with this method. It produces posterior distributions, and that is Bayesian speak for confidence intervals in the frequentist approach. So those are important because it gives us a measure of uncertainty. The treatment's effects are more accurate. Some researchers have found that in certain settings. And lastly, it allows us to identify heterogeneous treatment effects across different groups. So in other words, BART allows us to estimate the benefit of carrying it in for each variable that we've considered. That is a really exciting feature of BART, and we'll see what those look like in a minute. So like with propensity score matching, BART also allows you to estimate the ATT, and it was actually very, very similar to the one that we estimated with our propensity score model. So it was about 0.02. So a reminder, this is the exciting feature that BART allows us to do, and we can see what the estimated ATTs look like for each and every single covariate that we've considered. So the solid lines represent the true treatment effects, and the dotted lines represent those posterior distributions, so the uncertainty. And we can see for starting with the top left, gain seconds, and then moving on to GPM 60, length of shift, score differential, X entry. You can see that those solid lines look pretty stable, and that means that there is no benefit to a carry-in considering the different values within each and every single one of those. The only one that stands out is the Y entry. So it appears that above 60 feet, there is a clear benefit to carrying it in there, and that roughly corresponds to the middle of the ice. So there is a benefit to carrying it in the middle of the ice and not so much when you're near the boards. So if you remember this chart, we saw some pretty significant differences between defensemen and forwards. And looking at the ATTs, it is approximately 20% more beneficial for a forward to carry it in. And the next natural question, well, is does that benefit change if you account for the skill of the defenseman or the forward? And much to our surprise, it does not. So it is beneficial for forwards and defensemen to carry it in, no matter their skill level. The last finding that I will share with you is the ATT distributions for teams. So the way you read this is on top, on the left, you have the entry teams. So those at the top, it appears that they have more benefit to carrying it in. And as you go down the chart, that benefit decreases. And on the right, you have the defending teams. So the way to read this is that for the teams at the top, it's better to carry it in against these teams. And it's worse as you go down. So the next directions here is to continue to explore these team level effects. And in order to do that, we're going to have to account for more confounders. So some stuff that we'd love access to is the location of entry players before the zone entry. We'd also like the location of the opposing players pre and post entry as well. And there are many more we can think of, like direction of the player and so on. So some final thoughts. I'm sorry, I know I'm over time, but prediction and causation are different, and we certainly try to do the latter. Causal inference is really hard, and it's especially hard because we're working with observational data. And causal conclusions should be regarded as tentative, and I say this because you have to acquire a lot of domain knowledge before you can incorporate this into any sort of prescriptive analysis, and that jumps off the point of Ryan Stimson. To interpret that graph that we saw, for me it doesn't make much sense. So I do need to know more about team tactics, and I hope this audience has some thoughts on that. So thank you. My code is available for this analysis. You can scan the QR code if you'd like a write-up. Please reach out to me on Twitter for questions because I am way over time, and I would really, really love to hear your thoughts on this graph if you can. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go with the next graph.
We had a question.
Oh, we have a question. Okay, all right. Mike, go.
Hi, sorry, I just have one question. So is there a level of accounting that you could do for structure ahead of an entry that's sort of a little bit more granular than like we like the position of all of the people? Like could you have something like, oh, this is a drop pass entry, or this is a pure skating entry, or this is like, could you just break it down into like a couple of easy cases that the sort of thing that trackers would recognize, and even if you could, would it be worth it?
I think it would absolutely be worth it. Not all periods are the same and not all dump-ins are the same. I would definitely have to reach out to the folks at Staff and see if we can get that level of